Okay, welcome back. Glad to see there are even more people here now. We are a little off schedule, but that's fine because there's flex in the schedule. We have lunch coming next, and it's for a full hour, so no need to rush. Our second keynote speaker in the conference is Maggie Blackhawk. Maggie is professor of law at NYU and a prize-winning scholar and teacher of federal Indian law, constitutional law, and legislation. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Yale Law Journal, Supreme Court Law Review, American Historical Review, Legislative Studies Quarterly, Journal of the Early Republic, and Journal of Politics. I read this long list only to emphasize the scope of Maggie's contributions, which range across law, political science, and history, which is truly remarkable. She is the author most recently of the foreword to the Harvard Law Review, which serves as the basis for her talk today. And for those who don't know, the invitation to write the foreword is among the most prestigious recognitions in the legal academy. And without speculating about her age, I'll just say that it's an honor usually reserved for someone much closer to the end of their career than Maggie is. Because of all of this, one might be tempted to think that Maggie's success is a function of the popularity of her ideas, that these are ideas whose time had come. But I think that would be a mistake. For one thing, it would ignore the considerable friction that her work has encountered and has caused. But more importantly, it would ignore the significant work Maggie has done to cultivate the communities, the scholars, and the institutions that have pushed American colonialism and Native peoples to the forefront of legal thinking and writing. As much as anyone else, Maggie has created the moment in which her work is so necessary. So please join me in welcoming Maggie Blackhawk.
My sincere and now slightly emotional thanks to Professor Ewing for that very generous introduction and for the invitation. I think there is nothing that Connor can organize that I wouldn't readily attend and jump at being part of. But I think the conference today really surpasses even my own expectations of what Connor can achieve and his ability to grasp the connections. As he described, I think in my scholarship, he really is reflecting back on his own understanding, really reaching across disciplines and seeing connections in these projects that I was actually a little worried of following this panel and going, okay, this is going to be a completely different conversation, only to realize that the connections are so plentiful that I'm not even going to have time to really reference them all. So hopefully you can see them in the background as I run through my talk. But thank you again, Connor. I really, just a tremendous colleague. Everyone is lucky to have him. Okay, so down to brass tacks, because I know I stand between you and lunch. So the title of my lecture today is The Constitution of American Colonialism. And on the opening slide, you can see a painting by John Gast titled American Progress. Rendered in 1872, it depicts manifest destiny as this beautiful blonde woman with flowing white robes at the center of a process that was really transforming America at the time. So these processes of change were central to shaping, indeed the literal shaping, of the United States in the 19th century. But this is rarely an image that you see in relation to American constitutionalism. So Professor Ewing called on us today to think about the relationship between constitutional law and history in the context of crisis. And on Team Hope, like everyone else on the panel, I'd like to offer today that the history of American colonialism, as dark as it is, might help us better understand what constitutional law is, and perhaps through that, how to better identify and address matters of constitutional concern, as well as to resolve apparent conflicts. Okay, so this last November, as Professor Ewing mentioned, the Harvard Law Review published my foreword, the first of its kind to bring questions of American colonialism into conversation with American constitutional law. As Connor mentioned, it is very likely, as I described to my colleagues, the only time that the Harvard Law Review forward invitation resulted in a child being potty trained late. But it's written under duress. It is actually, this is average length. with the longest being Mike Klarman, who broke us all with a 300-page plus forward. You can muddle through that one if you'd like, but at some point I hope you might muddle through this one. But at its most general level, the Constitution of American colonialism brings the law and history of American colonialism to bear on U.S. constitutional law, history, and theory. It's a call to the field of constitutional law to better center American colonialism, and in particular, the perspectives of Native and other colonized peoples. The foreword is long, and makes a range of contributions. The genre is really seen as one to start a scholarly conversation rather than to make a singular contribution. But I'd like to highlight today some of the novel moves of the foreword as well as its relationship to the central questions of this conference. As I said, the connections to the panel are really just tremendous and too many, and I'll try to highlight what I can think of as I go along. But the reality is these conversations about constitutional crisis and creating constitutional opportunity are ones that I hope you see across this, as well as seeing the ways that this particular example starts to press on what we think of as outside the bounds of constitutionalism. Okay. So the panelists and Professor Roger Smith yesterday helpfully focused on the crisis aspect of constitutional crisis. And interestingly, our panel and my hope is to better reveal today the ways that history can help us understand the constitutional aspect of that constitutional crisis, and to reveal our modern constitutional culture as historically contingent, and thus denaturalize our understanding of what the Constitution is, what it is not, and in turn, what it and we might become. All right, so let's begin our conversation with a puzzle, one that the Supreme Court confronted and postponed this last summer in Holland v. Brackeen. That is the seemingly irreconcilable collision between the United States Constitution and the laws that regulate American colonialism. In Brackeen, the court was asked to resolve whether the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, in setting adoption and foster placement preferences for, quote, Indian children and Indian families, violated the equal protection component of the Due Process Clause by discriminating on the basis of race. The Supreme Court upheld the statute in a 7-2 opinion authored by Justice Coney Barrett. You can see the folks who have been highlighted in full color are the majority, and then the dissenters are grayed in the back, but also with a beautiful and moving concurrence by Justice Gorsuch. But the court upheld ICWA by declining to reach the thorniest constitutional challenge to the statute, that of equal protection, and through a ringing affirmance of the so-called plenary power doctrine, which gives Congress plenary power over Native peoples. So thus, equal protection challenges to federal Indian law and the laws of American colonialism writ large were thus left for another day, keeping alive the threat identified by the court in Morton v. Mancari that a, quote, entire title of the United States Code, 25 U.S.C., Indians would be effectively erased by the equal protection challenges of this kind. The result in Brackeen is a moment for celebration, but it's also a lesson in how far our elite institutions have to go before reckoning with American colonialism. And the reality is the court likely struggled fundamentally to reconcile its vision of constitutional equality and colonialism and to see the constitutional matters at stake. So from those challenging ICWA on equal protection grounds, the court saw the Constitution. So for folks who are to teach constitutional law, you can see the modalities running down the left side of this slide. We have text-ish, precedent, structure, prudence, ethos, honored authorities, so the modalities in full form, and supported by a range of historical argument. In response, on the right side of the slide, the law's defenders offered the court maybe prudence, a smattering of precedent, but as is the case in many constitutional adjudications in the context of empire, the arguments on the aside were a little non-traditional. The tribal and federal governments defending ICWA argued instead that the typical equal protection doctrine simply just didn't apply here. Although the statute regulated Indian children, this classification was not suspect because of the, quote, unique relationship between the United States and Indian tribes, as well as, quote, long-standing historical practice treating Indians differently because of their political status. And there was precedent honestly, in support of these non-traditional arguments. The Supreme Court had agreed that distinctive treatment of Indians did not offend the Constitution. But the precedent, Morton v. Mancari, was 50 years old and predated the more recent and more stringent concerns raised by the court over the use of racial classifications. Mancari also drew upon values, histories, and authorities that were not paradigmatically or even recognizably constitutional. A trust obligation, a history of judicial deference, Congress's unique obligation towards the Indian. So what is a congressional obligation in constitutional terms? What is a trust obligation? A unique legal relationship. These were a strained and strange set of constitutional arguments, but arguments that we've seen repeated again and again in a variety of similar forms across jurisdictions colonized by the United States. And the reality is that Burkina represents a rising tide of confusion and conflict. I wouldn't call this crisis, because this is our Constitution essentially doing, in many ways, what it was meant to do. Between the Constitution and American colonialism, and in the last 20 years, case after case has gone before the Supreme Court to challenge the laws regulating American colonialism on constitutional grounds. And many of these cases present similar puzzles to Burkina. So just 2 years ago in United States v. Valle Madero, the court resolved an equal protection challenge to differences in welfare spending for Puerto Rico. The same year, in Oklahoma v. Castro Huerta, the court unilaterally extended state criminal jurisdiction into Indian country with a gesture to the 10th Amendment. In 2020, the court resolved in Aurelius whether the Appointments Clause was violated by the appointment of the Promesa Board overseeing Puerto Rico's financial struggles and essentially governing the island today. So Rice v. Cayetano, Hawaii, U.S. v. Lara, Fidesamanu was a petition for birthright citizenship for American Samoa and an effort to overturn the insular cases. And then Sanchez Valle seemingly resolved the recognition status, this was through the court, of Puerto Rico under the guise of a double jeopardy challenge. And these are just a few of the cases to come before the court in recent years. Okay, so my lecture today will proceed in 3 parts. First, I'll introduce the law and legal history of American colonialism before turning in part 2 to an explanation of why I believe this legal history should be framed as constitutionalism, on par with that of the written Constitution, especially in the context of empire. And then finally, I'll close with a return to that constitutional collision between the United States and American colonialism to suggest ways that these histories brought together under the frame of colonialism might help us better understand the United States Constitution and potentially resolve these seeming conflicts and maybe others. Team Hope. All right, part 1, the law of American colonialism. It's hard to have these conversations and say I'm hopeful, but of course, once you get into these histories and see how far we've come, you can only have hope at the end. All right. So American colonialism, to the extent that it's recognized and studied at all, is generally examined piecemeal. These are images on this slide of the continental United States with tribal governments and reservations depicted, along with the island insular territories that are often seen as wholly disparate. They're rarely brought together. The study of these areas generally fall between specializations, diplomatic, native, and international history. Doctrines that regulate these areas are usually studied in isolation and are often described as incoherent, shifting unpredictably with the whims of federal policymakers and even inappropriately schizophrenic, as justices of the Supreme Court have defined them. Recently, however, legal historians, Professor Laurie Benton, chief among them, have called for scholars to build a legal history of American colonialism writ large and to study this legal and constitutional history within the global history of empires and imperial constitutions. So in the foreword, I bring together in a comprehensive way the legal histories of American colonialism over Native peoples, with colonialism over non-Indians during domestic expansion, as well as overseas colonization, and I bring together the legal histories of imperial subordination with those of the advocacy, empowerment, and vision of colonized peoples. So bringing together these legal histories under the banner of colonialism and seeing them as non-exceptional was quite revelatory, particularly in the way that it brought to the fore unexpected continuities that could begin to make sense of and simplify areas of law and history that are often seen as disparate, incoherent, and unrelated. The frame of colonialism also offers us a somewhat distinctive form of periodization. Rather than focus solely on the laws and histories of Indian country and those shifting whims of federal policymakers, we can start to understand the interplay of these laws and histories with the broader histories of American colonialism, including Western expansion and colonialism globally. The foreword focuses on three central points in the development of the law of American colonialism, and these are similar to points that historians have identified in the past: the establishment of the Northwest Territory and its governance by the Northwest Ordinance in 1789, the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, and overseas colonization in the late 19th century. So none of these central points tend to make it into constitutional law casebooks. Fewer make it into classes, and even fewer touch on those paradigmatic theories of constitutionalism that we hold dear. So the foreword highlights a range of continuities, but I'll highlight today one example of a continuity that came to the fore under the frame of colonialism. That is the, quote, blueprint for empire laid by the Northwest Ordinance that became stable constitutional doctrine, applied again and again to further the American colonial project. It was used as a guide during Western expansion for the admission of states. It structured overseas colonization, and it even laid the groundwork for the legal frameworks of self-determination passed by Congress for Native and other colonized peoples during the early 20th century. So the IRA and the Philippine Independence Act were actually passed months apart and shared features. So the blueprint for empire predated the founding of the United States Constitution at this time, in addition to creating a doctrine of colonization for a specific people, quote, Indians, that would be written explicitly into all of the founding documents, sadly including the Declaration and the Constitution. The United States began to create distinctive external spaces of colonization that it would call territories. Territories within the early republic were formed around contested jurisdictions. Jurisdictions like the Northwest Territory that contained predominantly Indians and Europeans. So the blueprint for empire would begin with the exclusion of other European nation states from a geography through treaty cession. In the Northwest Territory, of course, through the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and by bringing that territory into the national territorial borders of the United States. Next, the United States would vest all power into the executive, usually in order to take possession of an area, a condition under the law of nations that would perfect title of the lands through discovery or conquest, and then they would govern the area with its military. So, for example, even before the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, the Confederation Congress began the practice of governing the Northwest Territory through martial law. Then the United States government, they would govern those areas undemocratically and unilaterally while dangling the possibility of self-government if certain conditions were met. In 1789, the Northwest Ordinance crafted an unrepresentative civil government for the territory, a government not elected by the people but appointed unilaterally by the Congress. The appointed government would give way to greater and greater forms of representation based on the, quote, free male inhabitants who settled the territory. 5,000 free male inhabitants would result in an elected assembly and one voting delegate in Congress. Settlement of the territory by 60,000 free male inhabitants would culminate in statehood. Then after Congress reviewed and approved a constitution drafted by the territorial residents, and after those men petitioned the Congress, and the Congress approved the petition and the Constitution. So representative government was really not taken for granted within the context of the blueprint for empire, and nor were these territories afforded the ability to alter the constitutional character of the original 13 states. Instead, the ordinance established governing structures that would use federal power to govern and reshape the jurisdiction toward the constitutional character set by the original constitutional order. Governance for the territory, beginning with martial rule, moving toward unilateral, non-representative government, was then the pattern of blueprint for empire that repeated during the acquisition and governance of the Louisiana Territory, and then overseas colonization in the late 19th century. So the original blueprint for empire, of course, predated the United States Constitution, but it, of course, continued beyond the founding, and it interacted in important ways with constitutional development writ large. In 1803, for example, congressional ratification of a treaty between the United States and France approved the Louisiana Purchase. The United States then acquired title to almost 530 million acres of land, nearly doubling the size of the country. It was the first time that those borders had changed to reach beyond the Treaty of Paris since the polity had adopted the Constitution, at least to this extent. Before this moment, the power to govern Indians and to acquire their lands by treaty arose from the territorial sovereignty of the United States, and this was, under the law of nations, a power that presumably stopped or debatedly stopped at the founding borders and those territories within them. It was at this time that constitutional questions arose as to whether the power to colonize would reach beyond those territorial borders and whether the power would apply to non-Indians as well as Indians. Of course, as president, Thomas Jefferson doubted that the national government held the constitutional power to colonize foreign territory or foreign nations beyond the founding borders of the United States without a constitutional amendment to do so. In the case of the Louisiana Territory, these were lands predominantly governed by non-Indians in the South and Native nations in the North. And amidst negotiations between the United States and France, President Jefferson raised concerns privately that the national government lacked authority to even acquire by treaty or other means foreign territory or foreign nations. The concern was, of course, that bringing these foreign lands into the Republican constitutional structure of the United States could dilute the power of the original polity. Jefferson lamented, of course, that it was going to change the constitutional character entirely of the United States. If the national government could bring any foreign territory or nation in by simple treaty, it could presumably leverage those treaties or simple legislation to bring into the Union England, Ireland, or Holland. The United States had only recently shed itself of colonial rule of these nation states. How could it consent to a constitution that allowed these foreign states to join the United States through treaty? So Jefferson at the time prepared multiple drafts of a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would admit the Louisiana Territory, provide citizenship and rights to its white inhabitants on the same footing as other citizens, and make explicit that a constitutional amendment would be required to add any additional states from the newly acquired territory, as well as any future territories that were acquired. And for Jefferson, those proposed amendments would properly apply the principles of liberal constitutionalism to resolve concerns raised by the Louisiana Territory. It would clarify that these were, of course, enumerated powers, and it would also resolve problems of consent by allowing both the original state governments and those newly acquired populations to deliberate over and ratify decisions that could transform, and also would give the ability to transform the United States fundamentally and potentially actually change the constitutional order entirely. And so the amendments also would allow the relationship between these new lands and the Constitution. They would put those new lands hopefully on equal footing with the original territory by requesting their consent. But the amendment process envisioned by Jefferson, as we know, never took place. Pragmatism pushed Jefferson away from the principles and process that govern the Constitution and towards a constitutionalism that allowed for quotidian treaty law, treaties formed with, quote, civilized governments like the French only, to incorporate these borderlands and restrict citizenship by race. So in the blueprint for empire and its distinctive constitutional status actually did not stop at Jefferson's private reservations raised during the treaty process. The Congress went on to further debate and exercise the power to colonize these lands and people. So this was on the floor of the Congress. Rather than resolve the lofty constitutional controversies through Republican constitutional principles, Congress supported unbridled executive and military power, martial law, and force. On October 31st, 1803, Congress passed a bill allowing the president to, quote, take possession of and occupy the territory, and enabling him to use any part of the Army and Navy to facilitate the occupation and possession of these lands and peoples. The bill authorized the executive branch to exercise and direct, quote, all the military, civil, and judicial powers exercised by the officers of the existing government. So this is a delegation and a vision of the executive that I think reaches beyond what many think is even expansive. And then 5 months later, President Jefferson signed into law an act erecting Louisiana into 2 territories and providing for the temporary government thereof. As titled, the law split the land ceded by France into jurisdictions. Orleans, located before the 33rd north latitude line, which later became the border between Arkansas and Louisiana above. So for Louisiana, the act established a civil but unrepresentative government, appointed entirely by the President of the United States. The northern portion, of course, which was governed by predominantly native nations, was subject to the blueprint for empire settlement principles established by the Northwest Ordinance, one that incentivized settlement and settler colonialism of a certain kind. It was difficult, of course, to argue for a Republican liberal constitutional rule, temporary or not, that allowed unilateral executive and military power over non-consenting populations. Concerns were met with arguments that the Constitution of the Center simply just did not apply to foreign lands and peoples, the same arguments that had long justified European colonialism writ large. One senator argued for the power to govern Louisiana by conquest, so the law of nations. Others, including the territorial governor appointed by Jefferson, argued that the residents of Louisiana were next to a state of nature and unable to participate in Republican self-government. These foreign territories thus required a doctrine whereby they must pass through varying stages of progress before definite privileges were granted to them. So the Louisiana Purchase, as John Quincy Adams and others had feared, set bad precedent. The United States repeated the process again and again as it expanded across North America, and only when the territory was deemed assimilated through the process of settlement and following years and even decades of unilateral federal government would the Congress approve the petition for admission as a state. The Constitution of American colonialism was used to resolve those difficult questions of dispossession, incorporation, assimilation, and then statehood through the claim that the Constitution of the Center just wouldn't apply to the periphery until it reached a certain point of development and civilization. To the extent that any reasons were provided at all, this process was again, or this distinctive constitutionalism was rooted in a view that certain peoples were just too foreign or too primitive to engage in self-government. Specifically, Indians, the paradigmatic community who would not be able to engage in self-government, and certain non-Indian residents of the territories. So thus, the character of colonized peoples themselves demanded this distinctive constitutionalism. And outside of Indian country, of course, the Constitution of American colonialism was largely accepted as temporary. In the main settlement of these areas, so replacement of native peoples, predominantly by white settlers, would bring these lands under the auspices of the Constitution. The presence of racialized and non-English speaking, non-Protestant communities across the West required some form of variation in the colonial strategies that the Blueprint for Empire set, but federal oversight and territorial government in these areas became a process through which foreign communities could be overwhelmed by settlement, assimilated, or destroyed. So this is a constitutional process. Instead of allowing the center to change, the national government would just withhold statehood from those territories and govern them towards the constitutionalism that they envisioned. And often in those states like Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico for longer periods than others in order to civilize them into the Union. Louisiana Territory lands, of course, in Oklahoma were acquired in 1803, but they then only became the state of Oklahoma 100 years later in 1907, and that was only after Congress actually denied the petition by Native people to establish the eastern portion of Oklahoma as a state, the state of Sequoia. But Congress essentially denied that petition because they were not civilized enough and illegally annexed that eastern portion of Oklahoma, where cases like McGirt now allow us to raise other distinctive questions about governance. Okay, the law and legal history of American colonialism should motivate us to rethink a range of constitutional presumptions, including the simple story that we tell ourselves of state primacy in the federal system. The story is ultimately a myth. As Lucius Q.C. Lamar recognized, only 13 states deliberated and consented to the Constitution, and now the majority were created by essentially the invasion and unilateral governance of the federal government, a government created in the wake of the Constitution rather than created by it. And these states were thus brought into the Union without deliberation, agency, or any ability to contribute to a constitutional order with an amendment process that would rarely be met. And beyond, I hope, dispelling myths about the past, the story should also reveal ways that the legal technologies of American colonialism have really continued into the present. So the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which is the primary statute that structures the government-to-government relationship between the United States and Native nations today, so this is our super statute, was passed by the same Congress that drafted and passed the Philippine Independence Act. These two statutes share features with the blueprint for empire in offering forms of recognition for colonized people under constitutional governments that would be overseen by United States colonial bureaucracies. So let's move into the Constitution of American colonialism. So I suspect that our current constitutional culture and our Supreme Court cannot see American colonialism as a problem of constitutional order because it reflects a view of the Constitution that was born in the mid to late 20th century, that is, that we have only a positive, wholly written Constitution that can be derived mostly by courts through the interpretation and construction of the written text found within the four corners of the document. The laws of American colonialism were once recognized as a form of constitutional law, and these laws have been erased from modern constitutionalism, a modern constitutionalism that turned away in the 20th century from those dual written and unwritten aspects of constitutional law that had been dominant for much of our history, and instead turned towards the constitutional positivism that we embrace today. So what do I mean by constitutional positivism? When we think of the Constitution, we imagine it exists entirely within the four corners of this written document. And courts, of course, unpack that for us and give us interpretive answers. This was not always the case, as work of Jonathan Ginap, started doing that again now, Dan Holzebach and others have uncovered. But because we no longer see this thicker sense of constitutionalism where writtenness is but one aspect of a broader and more complex constitutional order, we no longer see the constitutional law and logics of American colonialism. We don't see, actually, even the broad contours of our own nation state. Because really, despite the erasure of these fundamental constitutional structures, laws, and principles from our courts, the public, and the legal academy, the United States remains an empire. The political branches continue to exercise these same constitutional powers and legal frameworks to colonize and govern hundreds of governments today. But we just don't recognize that anymore. So drawing upon recent work on the international legal history of empire, I situate the United States Constitution in the forward as sharing features with the dual constitutions of imperial nations across the globe, as well as in conversation with these constitutional discourses worldwide. Like many constitutions of empire during the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States Constitution had two faces, one for the colonizing polity and the other for the colonized. The United States Constitution, with which we were most familiar, would govern the colonizing polity. But the Constitution would also provide the national government with the power to govern others, Indians and territories, and spaces of liberal constitutional exception. And in these spaces, the national government built a constitution of empire over decades, a vast and intricate web of relationships between the central government and those it colonized. And within this outward-facing or external constitution, American colonialism has thrived. Like the tentacles of an octopus, it constructed the colonies and the jurisdictions they inhabit as borderlands of the United States. And I draw upon Frank Norris's octopus metaphor for the railroads, described by some as the infrastructure of colonialism of the American West, as an apt description of the constitutional technologies that were built to facilitate the American colonial project legally. The head, of course, would build a strong nation state through liberal constitutionalism, with the power and strategy of that head then driving the legs that would exercise the flexible plural power to govern others. So many would like to see the laws of American colonialism as unlawful, as unconstitutional, expressions of brute state power alone. So leaving aside for a moment the debate as to whether brute state power exercised by a government is constitutional law or not, I'd like to offer today that the law of American colonialism was always just more than brute power. Rather, these laws adhered to a higher reasoning, higher principles, and higher values, like all of our other constitutional decisions. However abhorrent these worldviews and constitutional cultures and values might appear to our modern ears. And colonized peoples advocated for legal and constitutional change in the context, in the discourse, and the lexicon of these doctrines, principles, and values. There were distinctive logics behind the exercise of the power to colonize and values toward which the American colonial project aspired. These were the logics expressed even in the writings of some of the most revered philosophers of classical constitutional liberalism, Vattel, Locke, and Mill, as well as others. Each of these men espoused the need for distinctive forms of constitutionalism for certain peoples who would be carved out of those universal liberal values and rights. John Locke, in his 1690 Second Treatise on Government, and Vattel in his highly influential 1758 treatise, The Law of Nations, responded to critics of colonialism with arguments for exception from the Law of Nations for Native people. Indians were just too savage or too close to a state of nature to form governments capable of being legally recognized within the Law of Nations, nor could they make claims. Thus, when a conflict arose between the claims of a civilized nation and an uncivilized one, the Law of Nations would resolve those claims against the colonized. Of course, no doubt these exceptions were deeply self-interested, instrumental, and pragmatic. Each of these men were personally and professionally involved with the colonial project worldwide. But that self-interest, which I think is found everywhere within our constitutional conversations, really can't reduce these complex, enduring, and recognized theories and doctrines to anything other than as complex constitutional theories and principles and visions similar to visions of liberty, equality, citizenship, the general welfare, separation of powers, and more. So the theories and principles that grounded the power to colonize often took the form of justification for the violent dispossession, invasion, and unilateral governance of non-consenting populations considered other or inferior. As father of modern liberalism, John Stuart Mill describes thus far, so to date, I've written of the dependencies, or in this chapter, whose population is in a sufficiently advanced state to be fitted for representative government. But there are others which have not attained that state and which must, so not may at this point, but must, by the time Mill gets around, be governed by the dominant country or by persons delegated for that purpose by it. And he went on to describe administrative law and delegation and bureaucracy as the best possible way of governing the colonies. But this statement by John Stuart Mill is illustrative of a liberal constitutional theory that created that exception from universal application to justify colonialism. And it was exemplary of the liberal developmentalism of his era. So over the long 19th century, these theories of an exceptional form of constitutionalism drove and structured the written aspects of the Constitution of Empire, those aspects forming the legs of the octopus, while the written head, and some of it unwritten as well, but largely written head in its liberal constitutional culture, constructed the nation state. So I'd like to provide two examples of these constitutional theories and discourses. The first is the doctrine of discovery and its related concept of terra nullius, found in Vattel and Locke, as well as other writers of the period, and general constitutional discourses writ large. So this is something that actually pervaded constitutional culture generally. So the doctrine of discovery and its principle of terra nullius, these empty landscapes, allowed civilized or Christian nations to seize the lands of savage peoples as they were considered empty landscapes, devoid of peoples who could make a claim upon those homelands as sovereign or with any vision of self-determination. The image you see on the slide is that of one by Albert Bierstadt. It should really come as no surprise that the great tradition of the landscape began to dominate American painting in the early 19th century. So like Bierstadt, who turned the American West in the mid-19th century to depict these empty, beautiful, virgin landscapes. These painters focused on vast, empty places as depicting them as ripe for the plunder and development of the painting's viewers. And these paintings served as essentially an aesthetic rendition of the constitutional discourse around the doctrine of discovery and its general principles. So I'm in Canada, which is going to be fun for this one. Although a more modern example, the slide shows the work of First Nations Cree artist Kent Monkman, who, among other projects, has taken to re-rendering the paintings of these old American masters like Bierstadt, only now with the presence and agency of living, lively, modern Native people. Similarly, Native people throughout history resisted these doctrines, these constitutional doctrines, by complying with them, arguing with them, and reforming them. They converted to Christianity, conformed to civilization standards. They made themselves visible and present. They argued for sovereignty, for recognition of a distinct, although subordinated form. They formed treaties. They essentially argued from the law of nations to co-create the constitutional doctrines of American colonialism and to use them to mitigate them from their most violent forms, forcing the rule of law principles to limit and structure the violence of colonialism through treaties, statutes, litigation, and other forms of legal advocacy, and to force essentially the political branches to recognize these new forms of constitutionalism and the reforms that they had enacted. Later in the 19th century, when colonialism had shifted globally from less populated lands like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and North America to urban centers like India. So this is how the global conversation and the global vision of colonialism starts to really explain the workings of these doctrines. The constitutional theory and doctrine around colonialism shifted accordingly, even domestically within the United States. Like that, of course, not within specifically the work of John Stuart Mill, but he and others argued that civilized nations also had the power and maybe even the duty to govern these uncivilized populations towards civilization. So this isn't conquest and discovery. This is now we have the power to show up and essentially just to take over, even if we can obviously now see you. So this was an exploitive process, but the point of it was supposed to be the power to civilize. So this is the painting School Begins by Louis Dalrymple. Painted in 1899, it really captures the way that the civilization power again took root as a constitutional discourse within the United States, even connecting these borderlands jurisdictions in ways that constitutional scholars no longer recognized. In the front seat, you see, of course, overseas colonization, Hawaii, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, as well as the many states now. You can see expansion happening in the back seats. Native people, of course, sitting by the door with the book so upside down that they may not make it. And you have Black Americans now depicted in the far left as cleaning the schoolhouse, not even worth the point of education. And then Chinese individuals, of course, are depicted as only coming to the schoolhouse door. The painting also reveals the way that race, racialization, and racial hierarchy took root as an aspect of the civilization principle during this time. So not only were these people savage, uncivilized, and unchristian, something that they could argue with and try and reform and prove themselves out of as a legal standard, now they were biologically and inherently inferior. That's harder to argue your way out of. So instead, Native peoples, colonized peoples, and others pushed for visions of the trust conception of civilization, one that was recognized by the Supreme Court in the context of Cuba for Neely versus Henkel in 1901, that if you were to civilize and to have the power to colonize these other jurisdictions, you would have to do it in trust, as a trustee and towards some end, to be able to colonize them. You couldn't just exploit them militarily and economically. But the vision of American colonialism as domestic constitutional doctrine began to fade from view in the 20th century. George Sutherland, depicted here in two different ways, once as territorial governor and another later as justice, was educated early in his life at the University of Michigan Law School. And he learned constitutional law from a treatise that actually cited Vattel and discussed expansion, had the Lie of Nations within it. But around the beginning of the 20th century, authors of these constitutional law treatises began to omit questions of external constitutionalism from our constitutional law treatises and now today our casebooks. They're seen as orthogonal, these other visions of external constitutionalism. The separation was especially influenced by the work of territorial senator and later Supreme Court Justice George Sutherland. And of course, he was territorial senator of Utah, where he helped break up the Uri Reservation and testified before Congress that unilateral executive power could do so. So he drafted his first essay arguing for this distinctive internal and external vision of constitutional powers, with the former governed by liberal constitutional principles, and the latter governed by inherent sovereignty and not at all limited by that written constitution. Sutherland later drafted these principles into constitutional law in the opinion Curtis Wright when he was appointed to the Supreme Court, and notably, of course, the Supreme Court sided to Curtis Wright in Brackeen just this last summer. So erasing the constitutional law of American colonialism was in part the result of theorizing this external constitutionalism as a distinct category of constitutionalism. These were areas of law that were left without principle. They were held separate from the rest of our constitutional culture and discussion and relegated to the plenary power of the political branches to solve. The category, of course, of what constitutes external constitutionalism is contested. It's changed over time, but it often includes foreign affairs, immigration, the war powers, and other exercise of government power over, quote, strangers to the Constitution, borrowing from Walzer and Gerald Newman, including also American colonialism. So when the forward identified these areas as fields of constitutionalism that were initially unwritten and didn't have that kind of textual hook that we can now jam all of our reasoning into, a constitutional law that was largely informed by and within discourses of the law of nations and have, since their erasure, been left to narrow and shallow constitutional conversation and contestation, if at all, in the courts, and because of our legal fixation on the courts within law schools, within the legal scholarly community writ large. So today, scholars have identified each of these areas of law as spaces of constitutional exception and even constitutional absence. I won't walk that way so you won't be able to hear me, but you can see in federal Indian law, of course, is sui generis, the late great Phil Fricke, immigration where normal constitutional reasoning doesn't apply, the law of the territories is a nearly an extra-constitutional zone. The powers of war and exigency, of course, are plenary. Treaty power is exceptionalism. And foreign relations law, of course, is subject to a different and generally more relaxed constitutional restraints. People now debate whether or not that should be exceptional or not, but we're not having deep substantive conversations about what are the constitutional principles within these areas. So these next few slides are going to have quite a bit of text on them. But I want to use them to illustrate briefly the fact that these areas of law once had behind them principles and logics that the court recognized and used explicitly to resolve legal disputes. So these doctrines were abhorrent, they were antiquated, some of them used racially charged language. If I had to do a trigger warning before every case in federal Indian law, I would never teach a class, but they are offensive often. But these were principles and logics that the court used and resolved legal disputes by. There was enough structure there to allow the court to make decisions. And they were driven by reason, logic, and deliberation, rather than deference without principle, which we see today. So in 1823, you have Johnson v. McIntosh, fierce savages whose occupation is war. So we have civilization discourse. We have conquest and discovery. 1832, Worcester v. Georgia. We have the law of nations referenced specifically. 1889, Chinese exclusion cases, foreigners of a different race in these countries who will not assimilate with us. So, of course, we have this now racialized vision of exclusion and the inability to self-govern. In 1901, in Downs v. Bidwell, which is one of the chief insular cases, we have inhabited by alien races where Anglo-Saxon principles just aren't going to apply for at least this period of time. So you have a civilization process and discourse. Compare these cases with Trump v. Hawaii, a case applying the plenary power doctrine to uphold the travel ban in 2017. So here you have just mere deference based on practice without reasoning or principle. The plenary power doctrine is not now a constitutional doctrine, at least within the courts. Rather, it represents a form of constitutional silence and the absence of constitutional conversation, at least, judicial conversation. And sadly, because of our law schools being obsessed with the judiciary, no conversation within the legal academy, or at least a marginalized conversation. Whereas the political branches actually have codified the trust doctrine and these other forms of constitutionalism. They continue to put them into law because they're continuing to colonize. So we see a similar dynamic in Brackeen. The court again deferred to congressional plenary power, but it struggled with any kind of principled limit on that power, and it's starting to express frustration that it just doesn't understand. It sort of understands where it's coming from, but it essentially erases the origins of that constitutional power and those earlier doctrines that have now limited, amended it, and changed it for the better over time. So getting back to our constitutional collision. So let's return first to our puzzle in Brackeen, now with our history. This is what history and constitutionalism can do together in hand. So from the challengers of ICWA, the court saw paradigmatic constitutional authority, the Constitution, our modalities, text, precedent, structure, prudence, ethos. And the law's defenders were, of course, more creative, and creative for the non-lawyers in the room is a pejorative term. And although they tried mightily to fit their arguments into these modern constitutional law frameworks, there was always an eerie sense that the most pressing issues were essentially falling off the briefs. We couldn't even make those arguments. So Yet in Brackeen, oops, we skipped a slide. Here we go. Yet in Brackeen, as well as a range of cases that address jurisdictions colonized by the United States, there's always a sense that the court actually does understand that these jurisdictions implicate distinctive values and structural issues. But the constitutional argument that's provided in the opinions generally turns on whether the Constitution applies or it does not. Or in Sanchez Valle, as well as others, if the Constitution does apply, the courts often bend history and law to craft an exception to those quotidian constitutional doctrines. So Aurelius, the Appointments Clause case for Puerto Rico, is a great example of this dynamic. In Aurelius, of course, the Appointment Clause applies because the Constitution, of course, works wherever the national government works. However, we're just going to make an exception for local officers because, as they referenced in oral arguments, the justices are concerned that to apply the Appointments Clause to the government of Puerto Rico means that the elected democratic representative government that they have allowed Puerto Rico to have, especially since the mid-20th century, would then be subject to the Appointments Clause. So that you'd have to elect someone, and then they would have to go through Senate and presidential confirmation, which is a little bit unsettling to self-determination. It takes away visions of self-determination. In other contexts, especially Indian law, the determination that something is not constitutional law or that decision to craft an exception really does turn implicitly on these constitutional values at stake in the context of American colonialism. These constitutional values that I hopefully have shown have been debated, shaped, and crafted into law by those political branches in particular since the founding. But the values and histories of American colonialism and its unwritten constitution have not found its way into the court in decades, at least not as explicit authority or text, because of this current limited vision of the Constitution as something that only exists within the four corners of the document. They spend all of their time trying to shove things into the text, even embarrassing themselves, rather than actually debating and trying to understand these broader issues. I offer today that unearthing this constitutional history and exploring the implications of this distinctive constitutional domain, that is, the dynamics of constitutional lawmaking and reform in the context of a broader vision of constitutionalism, may have the capacity to reshape our experience of our constitutional present. What is authoritative with respect to that constitutional present, by reshaping what constitutes the Constitution within that present. And it may allow us to better envision a constitutionalism that actually fits with our constitutional past and present. One that doesn't ignore the even shape of the United States, but understands it, describes it, and tussles with it as a matter of constitutional order. So these histories could also begin a conversation about broader visions of constitutional change. In the foreword, I describe an unwritten constitutionalism that's regulated certain geographies that I call borderlands, drawing upon a rich and deep literature from history and ethnic studies, and describe how we might benefit from the realization that our modern ears may no longer interpret meaningfully these constitutional discourses of our own past. They instead sound foreign and antiquated and vestigial. In the foreword, I introduce a range of constitutional principles that have developed over time in the context of American colonialism. These are principles that have been written in the blood and sweat of the advocacy of Native and other colonized peoples for decades. They've been codified into the central doctrines of American colonialism through statute, treaty substitute, and court order. In the interest of time, I'll only introduce them here, but you can see how they sound in the Law of Nations. They sound in this other constitutional discourse that has been cut out from our vision of paradigmatic national constitutionalism, internal constitutionalism in the 20th and 21st century. So part 2 of the foreword for the curious, who might want to learn more about these principles and their development, describes these developments, principles in greater detail. And in truth, of course, we may have just as much use today for the doctrine of discovery or the racialized hierarchies of the civilization discourse as we do for the Code Noir and other laws of human enslavement. But we should, at the very least, understand how these earlier constitutional doctrines have been amended over time. So we have gone, of course, from the nadir of American colonialism in the late 19th century, which was the nadir of colonialism everywhere, when the political branches of the United States believed that they had the constitutional power to build detention camps on Native homelands, to separate Native families, to put Native children into boarding schools, to criminalize religions, and political practices, those boarding schools, of course, having prisons in the basement for children as young as 8. And we've gone from that, this vision of a power to colonize where the United States could regulate every facet of native life, to the 20th and 21st centuries with their robust and articulate forms of self-governance and self-determination for our US colonies. So this is a story of hope, constitutional hope. The laws of American colonialism, of course, may be so shameful that we attempt to hide them, but they remain the most robust forms, at least in the United States, especially and as to compared to Canada. They are the most robust forms of self-determination for colonized people in the world. And these other Commonwealth countries, Norway among as well, are following and exporting and domesticating US domestic colonization law. The Indian Child Welfare Act, at the heart of the Blackhawk controversy, actually embodies these principles of self-determination and preservation. And the principles that have come to guide and actually limit the exercise of federal power in the context of American colonialism. And the political branches have come to embody and guide lawmaking and interpretation by these principles. And ICWA, of course, is showing that. However, because this constitutional culture, practice, and discourse has been narrowed by that simplified vision of constitutionalism, we just can't see this anymore. So returning to Brackeen before we end, let's imagine for a moment what a more capacious and more empirically informed vision of the Constitution would afford the court in better understanding the visions and values on both sides of this dispute, seeing both perspectives as constitutional law and involving higher order values, just different ones. It would allow us to better understand and theorize the structure of our Constitution, written and unwritten, as well as its history, rather than disguising this history through creative exceptions to our established constitutional doctrines or by distorting historical present and past realities. And it would allow people colonized by the United States to appear and argue those visions, values, and laws directly, and for the Supreme Court, and hopefully all of us, to understand them again. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions, but I'm going to leave us with a few prompts on the slide to ponder as we begin to center American colonialism within our constitutional law and theory, and begin to ponder what is left when we disrupt many of the simple myths about who we are, what the Constitution is, how we formed as a nation, and hopefully, on Team Hope, what we could possibly become. So thank you so much, and I look forward to our discussion. And I will handle the cue, so I look forward to any thoughts you might have, with a rising intonation at the end, hopefully. It just turns on automatically.
Okay, great. Maggie, thank you for a great talk and all your great work. So a few years ago, I had the privilege of directing an undergraduate honors thesis on the struggle over New Mexico's admission to the Union, which is extraordinarily fascinating and a dark story as well that I'm sure you're intimately familiar with. But what fascinated me is how it basically turned the Northwest Ordinance from super statute, basically extension of the Constitution, in which population thresholds triggered admission to the Union, into, actually, those are just suggestions for when Congress can think about this. And the explicitness of Congress in the 1850s of saying, well, New Mexicans are mostly non-white, non-Protestant, and non-English speaking, so they can't be admitted and are held out. I mean, I think they had the population in 1850 till 1912. So how do you think about, you know, the sort of unwritten constitutional status of something like the Northwest Ordinance and how it can transform over time and how we should think about that?
So again, I think it's interesting. You've lobbed onto the primacy that I've given of one example that is written in its original form, but not written in the Constitution. And so thinking about change in this written and unwritten and written elsewhere form of constitutionalism is something that I had hoped to capture within this broader churn over time. I tried to gesture to it a little bit in saying, okay, well, race actually comes into this and starts to transform this idea. Plus, the Northwest Ordinance was written for an area that was predominantly governed by Indians. And so when you're dealing with non-Indians, especially non-Indians who aren't going to be slaughtered or settled, you need a different form of constitutionalism. So the logics of that, of how we then derive what is constitutionalism in that context, is it the Northwest Ordinance or is it what it becomes? I would say it's what it becomes, and we need to better study and understand that process in those particular instances. This sounds a lot like living constitutionalism, but it's less so because we're not looking at due process and fixating on it and trying to find a different word for due or process or equal, or protection, whose perspective we're reading it from, but to instead start to understand unwritten, what are the intentions of the parties? Are they actually engaging what they believe to be constitutional discourse and constitutional change? Are there norms of constitutional change in this context? And are they adhering to them? Does it take, this isn't so much a constitutional moment, right? Because of course, and this is Bruce Ackerman's theories, because of course it doesn't, more than often doesn't hit the level of of political constitutionalism that he identifies. But these do have norms and values and practices to them. And my hope is to identify them not just here, but wherever they exist. So we can dig into New Mexican admission history, but to also start to understand constitutionalism in the borderlands in a particular context, of trying to understand why Louisiana is so quirky, right? Of trying to actually look at the ways that the Reconstruction Amendments, as being so central, were actually made central and also explicit in the admission of states, because many of the admission of those states to the Union forced the idea of just equal protection based on race into the constitutions of those states by the statute admitting them, as well as saying except for Indians. So there's a space where we actually get to see the Constitution of the center get to play out in particular ways. And so not only do we have a written and unwritten constitutional change that we need to theorize, but also the relationship between writtenness elsewhere with the Northwest Ordinance, as well as the written Constitution itself and formal constitutional amendment there. Vic?
Hi.
Oh,
Is this
sorry.
going?
I should follow the microphones rather than
That's
the
okay.
hands.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful talk, and I look forward to reading your forward. And thank you for bringing Kent Monkman into the story. I guess my question is, one, could you just tell us a little bit more about what you meant when you were referring to Canada right at the end there, about the comparative perspective there? And also, how do you understand treaties to be part of either constitutional silence or external constitutionalism, especially like in the line of the work of people like Heidi Stark or John Burroughs, where they're thinking about treaties not necessarily as just coming from the American or Canadian perspective, but also coming from Indigenous traditions. Thank you.
Yes, okay. So Canada, I almost started this talk with the aesthetics, right? I was pressured. I was thinking, okay, I'm going to start this with Bourgeois, Maggie Blackhawk, Indigenous cause. I'm Maggie Blackhawk. This is what we get here in Canada. We get this beautiful presentation of aesthetics. We get land acknowledgements, but no sovereignty. And the idea of ICWA, right, which you have your ICWA, it was just litigated before your Supreme Court, and it barely, the court struggled over whether or not tribal governments could govern the welfare of their own children. Norway, for example, not a Commonwealth country. I'll go to the other Commonwealth countries in a second. Norway is litigating its Marshall Trilogy right now. I say that only because we're having a Borderlands Constitutionalism conference there in the next year at the University of Bergen, because the same concepts are happening all over these different areas. We exported, or the United States exported, Canada adopted the domestic laws of American constitutional colonialism in the 20th century, as did Australia and New Zealand, but they flattened it down to property principles rather than sovereignty and recognition principles. And it's created a huge hurdle for Indigenous populations within Canada, who are of course supported by the beautiful social democracy of Canada. And this gets to Aziz Rana's book. Social democracy does not give us a good colonial framework. CEG Canada and New Zealand and Australia to a degree, and Norway, of all places, right? It doesn't solve these problems. These are different problems. And so my hope is that we can move beyond aesthetics in these places, or at least understand also the relationship, because we don't get aesthetics in the United States. To understand why you get off the plane in New Zealand and see Maori everywhere, but don't have any recognized sovereignty and even arguments for breaching the Treaty of Waitangi. And so these countries, I think the domestic laws of constitutional colonialism are themselves a right place for comparative work. which I hope will be done. As far as treaties go, again, this gets into why comparative work would be interesting and helpful. But in the United States, at least, there were some, and many, you can even see the borders of the United States as forming a kind of constitutional concept. The Constitution was going to be read against the background of these treaties. So of course, in a certain sense, Native people believed that they're arguing around changing fundamental constitutional laws and norms when they're debating around the treaty process. They thought they were amending, essentially, or resolving the conflict of the Articles of Confederation by trying to give the federal government clearer power over Native people by setting a treaty. And just with a few tribal governments, which was also fascinating and interesting. But to have those treaties not be seen themselves, and this is the hard part around Indian law, because treaties are often seen as so central that we can't get around them and actually start to get into the structures of recognition and bigger visions of structural change in government. That to see treaties as a tool in constitutional change, rather than as the heart of sovereignty for Native people, or the constitutions for tribal governments, as Phil Fricke has argued. Vic?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for this really wonderful and rich talk. And someday we'll all have to get together, people who think the Constitution actually is not constructed in America by courts, and write a book so that we can teach it. So I guess I want to sort of push back on a couple things and deliberately oversimplify what only became clear in the last slide, and I'm sure is explicated in the foreword, which I look forward to reading. That of structure, you put that at the top. So one question I have is, can we answer this problem not through writtenness versus unwrittenness, but just by recognizing that the majoritarian branches of the American government under our separation of powers system actually engage in constitutional decision-making and have traditionally, throughout the history of our country, even if this court thinks it is above that system and it believes that the other branches don't make constitutional decisions. So that's one simplification. Yeah. And the other simplification is, well, obviously, what we know from the post-1945 period and what liberals have been obsessed with is the fact that majorities will oppress minorities. So if you give constitutionalism to a majoritarian institutions, they will oppress them and continue oppression. Which brings me to the question, how do we explain the positive hope that you've given? That we actually, in our system, majorities have actually protected minorities, and they can be resilient protectors of minorities.
Yes. So I think it's funny, my answer to both of your questions is going to be interrelated and similar. So the idea that why do we have to go into written and unwritten constitutionalism? Why can't we just do legislative or political constitutionalism and just end there? So I wrote, this was the strange part, I published legislative constitutionalism and federal Indian law a couple of months before I published the foreword. And legislative constitutionalism and federal Indian law gets a little bit to what you're describing of, can't we just see broader constitutionalism beyond the courts, and isn't that enough? Why do we have to get into this weird, crazy, like, law of nations nutsiness and unwritten constitutionalism, which is going to paralyze and terrify everybody? So the reason why I've done that is because, in many ways, to see the political branches as the actor here and the sole actor here, and this also gets into the 1945 period, makes it seem like the United States is just really nice compared to Canada, which is not true. What it is just a different form of advocacy and engagement through legal norms by Native people within the United States territorial borders, colonized people within the United States territorial borders, turning to both law of nations and then international law in the post-1945 period, and then forcing those international law norms into political branch action. So self-determination, like my students are always aghast because I get these radical students and I say, okay, your heroes are Richard Nixon and Neil Gorsuch. Welcome. And so we have Richard Nixon and the beginning of the self-determination era in domestic law of the United States. And that's coming from not just the sweetness and wonderness of majoritarianism, and this was something that was on the earlier panel that I just sort of cringed a little bit at, of the idea that social movements always need to turn to majorities and to convince the political public, that belies the entire way that our Congress works, right? And has long worked. It has never been majoritarian, and it is less majoritarian now. Actually, no, in the past I think it was less majoritarian now. And it's more majoritarian as we forced it towards democracy. But the direct engagement with lawmaking bodies, political branches, the administrative state, lobbying, petitioning, these sorts of things are part and parcel of colonized people to where public discourse never shifts. That's why we get, in some ways, the aesthetics in Canada, but without the power, because the public would, of course, rebel. So the more I talk about this as constitutional discourse, the more I talk about it as a form of public engagement, the more I raise visibility, the more likely it is that I inspire a backlash and a disengagement with this, the ability of this advocacy to succeed. And so it's important to think about why legislative constitutionalism doesn't solely capture it, although it may capture more of the unwritten constitutionalism than the court does in the 20th century because the court has forced it there, but also to understand what is constitutionalism within that and why it's so weird and why the discourses are so weird in these contexts and these areas over time, and why we need to get beyond even just simple legislative constitutionalism. And it starts to explain, of course, why 1945, when you take it into, this isn't just like the cuteness of majority politics within the United States, but actually global international conversations that are getting forced directly into lawmaking bodies that the public may not agree with at all. They think self-determination and decolonization is insane in the context of Africa, but they're able to force it into domestic policy through getting Commonwealth status for Puerto Rico, self-determination for Native people, and so we get this separation even of international law and how the U.S. behaves there and how it crafts its domestic law of colonial constitutionalism. Rogers.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about as well. Your understanding of the processes through which the United States has come to greater, if still limited, recognition of rights of self-determination, preservation, and so forth. You've stressed that arose out of the advocacy of colonized peoples, but why were they able to have some success? Do you understand that as essentially invoking international law, post-World War II international law agreements that the U.S. felt compelled to live up to, and if so, why? Do you understand that they were able to reposition what you've called the liberal principles of the internal Constitution and say that those principles require greater recognition and self-determination, and that maybe the governing elites ideologically felt compelled to accept that? Or were there other interests at work that led the national government to make concessions that go beyond what we see elsewhere, domestic or international political power interests that produce those results?
Yes, no, it's a great question. And I think one that also helps us to understand these internal and external, especially in the context of American colonialism, why I think drawing this line, not only does it help us, as constitutional scholars to identify these areas that we need to think more about, but also to understand constitutional discourses of people, social movements trying to force themselves in rather than to create separateness and to create the relationship of that separateness. But also to understand the centrality of administration and bureaucracy, of what that government is and who the government decision makers are. So, of course, since the IRA, there's, and even before actually, the Native people advocated for a hiring preference of tribal citizens for the entire administrative apparatus that govern them, for the federal government. So they have taken over the federal government over the course of decades within the 20th century. So when you say these elites and these lawmakers, what they've done is replace and reshift the lawmaking process around them, including their own constitutional governments over their own local, at least, affairs, and as well as compacting with states and other governments. They've been able to essentially make themselves the lawmakers in a way that, and make themselves the federal government, and to take over the aspects of them, hospitals, schools, they have been just reclaimed through contract and compact from the federal government. So rather than actually having to take international legal agreements and say, hold the United States to them, because that wouldn't work, because the U.S. doesn't follow its own international legal agreements, especially around self-determination. They instead have injected those principles into statutes and regulations and the operation of the national government over time. I want to make sure that so as far as repositioning, I'm sure the broader history of constitutional liberalism over the 20th century and the 21st century has also impacted in positive ways this external constitutionalism. The tempering of that liberal constitution makes us, less likely to go and take my son away, for example, and put him in a boarding school. It's just less likely to happen because people would be horrified. We see ourselves as a different kind of vision of constitutional culture. However, we take away the children of non-citizens and put them in prisons. And so we do this in other contexts. We just shield it from our constitutional discourse in a particular way. I'm not sure that I've fully answered your question, which is very rich, but I do think that there is this, there's a distinctiveness in this area that I think should be understood as, because it's restructuring the government. It's visions of restructuring the government entirely. You see this also in disability law and labor, where there are different forms of constitutionalism where they are trying to do similar structural reforms. But I do think it's particularly distinctive in the context of colonialism. Hopefully I've answered that, but I'll think about it some more as well. Do you want to try it without a microphone? Oh, somebody has a microphone.
Hi, yes. Thanks. Thank you for your fabulous talk.
Thank you.
So rich and thought-provoking. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to this idea of the sites where the structures of recognition are happening differently and may, in fact, have constitutional principles embedded in them, but may take a different form. So I was thinking about the idea that in some registers, the critique of jurisdiction in Oliphant that has enabled tribal peoples has come from different grounds of argument, different grounds of contestation. So I was thinking about VAWA and the kind of activism around missing and murdered Indigenous women, where they've used the problem of jurisdiction to leverage open the foreclosure of tribal rights and tribal jurisdictions and tribal legal systems. Could you talk a little bit about where you see those opportunities and where you see different kinds of constitutional principles actually presenting in a much more direct way when they're not arguing in terms of the language of self-government or self-determination?
That's interesting, because I guess I see jurisdiction and recognition as all, maybe I'm just too stuck in it, but I see those as clearly spaces of jurisdiction and self-government and self-determination. They're not using that language, of course, but recognition is, of course, an aspect of the law of nations. It's a nation-to-nation vision of principles and values. And the recognition power, to the extent that that's in the Constitution. So we have the idea that it's largely lodged in the president, but over time, and the court has actually recognized this, and Zivotofsky, that colonized people and native people have shifted recognition in the context of American colonialism to be both dual between the Congress and the president, as well as we actually do have documentation of the courts doing judicial recognition as well. And the Congress has been better formed at recognizing tribal governments more recently, even in the administrative process. And so it's a translation, to my mind, it's an argument both from this other constitutionalism and then in the 20th century, as Native people were forced more and more into this clause-bound textualism, to find ways to translate those constitutional powers, like the treaty power going into treaty substitutes and collaborative lawmaking in the 20th and 21st century, and arguing from jurisdiction, which again doesn't, maybe we could say federalism and jurisdiction starts to play with the court, and especially the more recent, Berger and Roberts courts, Rehnquist courts around federalism and jurisdiction. But the most interesting thing to me about Oliphant is, and this is something that I've tried to make clear as much as I can in these conversations, is that Oliphant is the court taking the plenary power of the political branches and exercising it itself. In Oliphant, the court held that tribal governments do not have criminal jurisdiction over crimes committed by non-Indians, even within Indian country. Normally, to decide the power of tribal governments, the recognized sovereignty and territorial sovereignty of tribal colonized peoples, even, Justice Taney did this, the court defers. It says this power is in sovereignty of these political branches. They can be terrible, but they're going to do this. In Oliphant, the court says explicitly, we can't tell. We can't tell if the political branches did anything, but we just think it would be bad. That is a determination in its own exercise. It breaks down at least the semblance of a separation of powers principle and creates, in essence, a dormant plenary power doctrine in the context of the courts. And the modern court hasn't recognized that it's doing this, and it hasn't started to back away from those things. So there are spaces of constitutional conversation within these areas that the court could engage in, separation of power, that sound more familiar, but there also are translation points. And those are translation points that, you're right, have come in the 20th and 21st century as the fight has moved more explicitly from law of nations, doctrine of discovery, these other bigger principles into what piece of text can identify, to where even in Brackeen, this is hilarious. You should read it. I think I have a slide up, actually. So it says, they wrote in there, this is clearly a power. The plenary power arises from the Constitution. Of course it does. It arises from the Constitution. The Indian Commerce Clause, right, text. The Treaty Clause, pre-constitutional powers, and the trust relationship. That is in just a few paragraphs. And so again, what we have is both the translation and effort to translate, to force into these areas, as well as, and you see this also in Puerto Rico and all the territories, the effort to just jam reasoning into spaces where it doesn't totally fit. And that process is more complex than I've described here. Great question, thank you. Please. Oh, I'm sorry, the microphones are moving as well. I think up here, there's someone here.
Well,
Yeah, please, just go ahead.
I apologize.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Ron should go ahead.
I did not even see you.
I think somebody else was next, and then I was told to go next, but Ron, good.
We may run out of time also. We can lump your questions and
we can
answer.
do that.
One more. Oh, I'm sorry. Connor says no.
First you, and then.
So, a quick.
Connor apparently doesn't say.
Okay.
Connor's rule.
All right.
Connor is not a constitutional law.
All right, so let me ask quickly,
Please.
just in the name of defending Canadian jurisprudence on the issue. I mean,
Thank
you were
you.
so nice and Canadian in saying that it's all about niceties here. So let me push you on that on two fronts. One is
Not that
the
nice.
duty to consult jurisprudence that in Canada has been a big ticket item over the last 20 years, and there were some rather, I don't know, progressive rulings by the Supreme Court and our Supreme Court. And the second, and I think I asked you this question a couple of years ago already, so excuse me,
Hopefully I'll
is
get it right this time.
this Desautels decision by the Supreme Court of Canada from, I believe, 2021, that in a blatant fashion gave preference to treaty rights and self-determination, I don't know self-determination, but self-membership definitions. It's tricky.
Awfully wiggly.
Yes, over citizenship. So basically, a non-Canadian citizen who crossed the border to Canadian territory and got, committed all sorts of offenses, and then to his defense invoked treaty rights, and the Supreme Court supported that. I mean, that's a breakthrough.
Yes. So I don't at all mean to say that these countries have nothing. They actually have a complex and robust form of constitutional law around their own colonization. But again, it looks nothing like the constitutional recognition. The duty to consult, of course, in the administrative process, nobody likes it, but it actually is it's longstanding and as in greater conversation, even through compacting and co-management in the U.S. So it's just you see more robustness rather than this trailing behind. And so to say 2021, we had a case 3 years ago that recognized a treaty. Adorable, but the city of Tulsa is now within the Muskogee Creek Reservation, which is what I say to you, what we did a few years ago, and has not been overturned by the Supreme Court to many's most folks' confusion. Please.
Follows up fairly
Yes.
directly, actually.
Oh,
I mean,
no,
I love
Canada.
this concept of the aesthetics as against the real sovereignty issues, et cetera. Connor, do you mind? Or is so I'm curious in some ways what it would look like to get to real sovereignty and what the unraveling of colonialism would look like in some of these countries. And when I look at Latin America, I see the beginnings of that to some degree with plurinationalism. But on the other hand, on the one hand, that's been resisted. So, for example, in Chile, the Mapuche, the Aymara, and some other communities have pushed up against that because they hate the idea that it would de-emphasize their Chileanness, which is understandable. And so they voted in large numbers against a plurinational constitution. And I wonder if, and when you think about what a plurinational constitution looks like, it seems like it's the aesthetics that you're talking about. Maybe it doesn't involve, real power, real sovereignty. So, even that, which seems really aggressive and important, maybe just like the land acknowledgements and the other aesthetics. So I'd be curious what your view of that is.
Yeah, so in the United States, tribal governments get to govern land masses and peoples that are larger than several states. They have constitutional governments, polices, legislatures, schools, hospitals. Many of them actually have had, not just Alaska. The Alaska Native Health System is exemplary, but even within tribal governments within the U.S., so colonization, we are the bon colonizers, to use the, oh my goodness, what is bon, it's Portuguese. So Portugal love to think of themselves, we are the good colonizers, right? So America is the bon colonizers. But how do we undo this? Undoing colonization and doing good colonization, I think, are very different things. And self-determination would be at the heart of that. So rather than just determining one constitution that recognizes everybody, but may actually give the people who are colonized the decision-making power to Puerto Rico, maybe become a state, right? To Hawaii, maybe not become a state. And so to have these conversations, tribal governments maybe become a state, maybe become a locality, maybe become independent, an enclave state, that we need to actually start to understand our federalism, which was, of course, again, a law of nation, international law, and to a certain extent, vision of structuring that's part of our Constitution. It gives us more flexibility. So this is, sadly, the circular point of this argument to say we need to broaden constitutionalism to understand how to solve this problem, because otherwise we end up with equality and recognition and land acknowledgements rather than land back and empowerment. And treaty, not just treaty rights, but treaties as a form of collaborative lawmaking that's ongoing. I guess that's a point for lunch.
I hate to cut the conversation short, but it's a sign of how wonderful this talk was, and I think I stepped on applause that was coming. So let's thank Maggie.